So we just completed our lab on melting ice with the scientific method, and what we're going to talk about now is how to write a proper conclusion and make a proper data table for a lab in chemistry. This is a skill that we will use many times throughout the course of the year, so I want to provide a model that you can refer back to as we do more experiments during this class. I have my lab already written up for you guys, but I'll walk you through some of the more important parts of your lab as we go through this process. I'll highlight the pieces that you need to include in your lab, so when you and your partner are done watching this video, you can open up your Google Doc and get started on your own conclusion. So the first thing we want to do is we want to give our lab a title. What you'll do for this lab only is you'll give me the period, the name of you and your lab partner, and the title for the lab, which you can see at the top of my screen here. We were looking at melting ice based on the scientific method. So, to understand my lab report, you need to have an idea of what variables I tested in my lab. So my lab was a little bit different from you guys. What I did was I looked at one ice cube in each beaker that contained 125 milliliters of water that was either hot or cold, and then I did not stir them. So I was simply looking at the relationship between melting time and temperature of the water. So my hypothesis would be the first thing you would see after the title. So my hypothesis for the lab is that if an ice cube is placed in a beaker of water at 50 degrees Celsius, it would melt faster than an ice cube placed in a beaker of water at 20 degrees Celsius. So you would go ahead and put whatever hypothesis you created for your lab, because what that's going to do is it's going to drive the data table that we'll create for this lab. So since I am looking at time and temperature, that is the data that I should include in my data table. So things that you need to think about for a data table is you should always give it a really descriptive title, and you need to make sure that you include the data that you need to support or refute your hypothesis or purpose for your lab. So since my hypothesis was looking at time and temperature, that's what I included in my data table. You can see that I had one row that looked at the time needed for my ice cubes to melt, and I had a second row that looked at each trial that I did. So my first trial, I had my water at 50 degrees Celsius, and my second trial, I had my water at 20 degrees Celsius. So this would be the starting point for my data table. What we need to do now is give it a really awesome title, so that way the scientist who is reading your lab understands what that data is showing. Because right now, if we don't look at the title, all we see is we have 50 degrees of something that took 2 minutes and 30 seconds, and we have 20 degrees of something that took 4 minutes and 50 seconds. So we want to have a really descriptive title that helps the chemist to understand that data. So since we were looking at ice and melting time, we want to make sure our title reflects that. So a really great title for this data table would be the amount of time required for one ice cube to melt in 125 milliliters of water at varied temperatures. So right there, I now know as the reader of this lab that time tells me how long it took for one ice cube to melt in 125 milliliters of water at that specific temperature. So I now know that that time reflects how long it took the ice cube to melt. And that ties into our hypothesis. And that's super important because we need it to help write our conclusion. So for our conclusion for this slide, what we want to do is give a really quick summary of what we did. We want to refer back to our hypothesis or purpose, depending on what type of lab we're doing. We need to make sure that we use data to support or refute your hypothesis. And this is the most important part of your lab report, is including that data. If you don't include those numbers from the data table up here, you're really going to miss out on making sure that you're getting a well-formed conclusion. So you must include the data. So that's the most important part. And then what we want to do last is we want to choose a part of our procedure that could be changed if we were to redo the lab. Because our labs are never going to be perfect, so we need to make sure that we're always evaluating our procedure to get the best possible experiment in the future. So let's go ahead and look at my conclusion. So my summary is going to come first. This experiment tested the relationship between the temperature of water and the amount of time needed for the ice cube to melt. To test this, one ice cube was placed into a beaker containing 125 milliliters of either 50 or 20 degrees Celsius water, and the time needed for the ice cube to melt was recorded. So that's just a really quick summary of the lab for the chemist, because typically when we're having a lab report, there's going to be a lot more than just a data table and conclusion, so it kind of gives us a nice refresher of what we did in the lab. After we've given our summary, what we want to do next is talk about the data. So we're always going to go back to our hypothesis or our purpose next. So this is the really important part here, where we're going to go through our hypothesis and talk about the data that we collected. So it was hypothesized that an ice cube placed in 50 degrees Celsius water would melt faster than an ice cube placed in 20 degrees Celsius water. So there's going back to our hypothesis. Now we want to use our data to support or refute it. So the results of this experiment support the hypothesis because the ice cube placed in 20 degrees Celsius water had a melting time of 4 minutes and 50 seconds, while the ice cube placed in 50 degrees Celsius water had a melting time of 2 minutes and 30 seconds. So right there, I've put my data in my conclusion and I've said, I know my hypothesis was supported because my hot water melted in this time and my cold water melted in this time. And that is what supports my hypothesis. So we have drawn our conclusion at this point. Now, our labs aren't always going to be this simple, so our conclusions will be a little bit more extensive, but for something this simple, your conclusion is basically done. Now, all we have to do is talk about a procedural change. And one of the easiest things to evaluate is the ice cubes. All I did was put one ice cube in each beaker. I didn't really weigh it or anything, so that can be the change for next time. If this lab was to be redone, one should mask the ice cubes before placing them into the beakers to ensure the same amount of ice is used in each trial. Now, since I took that change, you can't take that. That's mine. You have to come up with something else for your lab report. So I hope that you guys found this useful, and I want you guys to get started on writing your conclusions. And please make sure you share them with me before you're done. We'll talk to you soon, guys.